In the quiet lands of Anatolia, where the hills roll softly and the skies stretch wide and pale, a great silence followed the fall of a mighty empire. The Seljuks, who had once ruled across Persia and into the heart of Asia Minor, had crumbled under the slow weight of time, invasion, and inner division. Their palaces faded. Their roads broke apart. Their banners, once firm in the wind, sagged into memory. It was not a sudden collapse. It was gradual, like dusk creeping across a valley. In their place, the land did not fall empty. Instead, it grew uncertain. Across the vast plains and mountain passes of Anatolia, scattered tribes and clans began to move, quietly, steadily, sometimes with hope, sometimes with fear. These were the Turkmen, nomadic families who lived close to the earth, guided by their animals, their prayers, and the old rhythms of the steppe. The Mongol invasions from the east had changed everything. The thunder of their horses had rolled over kingdoms, crushing certainty beneath their hooves. In the Seljuk heartland, their coming had broken the spine of old rule. Yet in the wake of this destruction, the Mongols had little interest in governing these far western lands closely. What they left behind was a fractured frontier. And frontiers are places where new things can begin. In this broken mosaic of Anatolia, beyliks began to form, small principalities ruled by warlords, sheikhs, or tribal leaders. Some lasted only a few years. Others grew for a time before vanishing into dust. It was a land without clear law, where loyalty shifted with the seasons, and where each village, each valley, had to fend for itself. But not all who lived there were warriors. Many were farmers, shepherds, metalworkers, women who wove in silence, children who played in the dirt while their fathers stared at the distant horizon. These people, caught between old empires and new chaos, simply lived, day by day, with the memory of peace behind them and the uncertainty of the future ahead. And among them was one small tribe. A quiet people, living near the edge of the Byzantine frontier, where Christian lands began and Muslim lands thinned. This tribe followed a man named Ertuğrul, a loyal commander once under the Seljuks. When his time passed, leadership fell to his son, a man named Osman. He did not begin as a conqueror. He began as a caretaker. His people were few. Their holdings were modest. But Osman had something that many of the other warlords did not. He had vision. Not the loud kind, not the kind spoken with shouts or steel, but the slow-burning kind, made of belief, patience, and quiet resolve. He built slowly. He listened to the elders, welcomed scholars and mystics, and treated his neighbors with care. While others raided recklessly, Osman chose his battles. Where others imposed, he invited. His strength was not only in the sword, but in the way he made people feel seen, safe, respected, and in a land filled with shifting loyalties and forgotten cities, that mattered more than power. Over time, his tribe grew. Villagers under threat came to him for protection. Fighters without cause pledged themselves to his name. He didn't yet know what would come of it all. But even in the smallest movements, the first roots of an empire had begun to reach down into the soil. And as the wind passed over the Anatolian hills, soft and steady, a new name began to carry with it. Osman. A name that would echo, quietly at first, but one day, across continents. He was not born into greatness. Osman, son of Ertuğrul, did not inherit an empire, a city, or even a castle. He inherited a people, modest in number, fiercely loyal, hardened by hunger, softened by faith. They lived near the frontier, a place where borders blurred, where the Islamic world touched the edges of Byzantium, and where opportunity was often wrapped in danger. Osman did not shout to be heard. He did not raise his sword simply to be seen. Instead, he observed, listened, waited. He was, above all, patient, something rare among the restless beys who surrounded him. While other tribal leaders chased quick glory through raids or reckless alliances, Osman built something quieter. Something slower. But something meant to last. He was deeply religious, not in the way of loud sermons, but in the steady rhythm of prayer and justice. He kept close to the Sufi mystics, whose words spoke more of inner strength than of conquest. He believed that leadership was not granted by blood alone. It was earned in how you treated your people when no one was watching. In how you shared your bread. In how you listened to the complaints of the poor. In how you buried your dead. And so, Osman began to lead. His earliest campaigns were not grand. They were small, calculated strikes against nearby Byzantine forts, not to dominate, but to defend and expand his people's space to live. These victories were modest, but they mattered. Every fortress taken meant safer routes, more pasture, more families who could sleep without fear. He married the daughter of Sheikh Bali, a wise and well-loved Sufi teacher. This bond gave Osman not just guidance, but legitimacy in the hearts of those who respected the Sheikh's wisdom. It was during one of his visits to Bali that Osman is said to have had the famous dream, the one with the tree that grew from his chest and cast its shadow across continents. But dreams alone do not build dynasties. Actions do. And Osman acted with a quiet purpose. He welcomed refugees, Muslims fleeing Mongol invasions to the east. He provided for wandering dervishes and Sufi saints. He sheltered orphans. All the while, his warriors, the Ghazis, rode under his banner, not simply for wealth, but for belief. For the idea that they were part of something sacred. Something larger than themselves. In time, his small territory grew. Villages turned into towns. Outposts became strongholds. And his name began to spread, slowly, softly, through the hills and markets of Anatolia. People spoke of Osman not just as a warrior, but as a just man. A wise man. A man who did not forget the weight of responsibility. He did not call himself Sultan. Not yet. But the seeds of empire had been planted, not through thunder, but through the patient work of one man and his people. And one day, long after Osman's voice had faded into memory, that empire would take his name. The Ottoman Empire. One night, as the stars turned quietly above the Anatolian hills and the world lay hushed in sleep, Osman rested beneath the roof of a humble home. The home belonged to Sheikh Bali, a revered mystic, a man whose wisdom was not shouted from pulpits, but poured gently into the hearts of those who sat near him. Osman was young then, not yet known by many. He had no palace, no throne, only a small following, a quiet heart, and a restless soul filled with questions. That night, a dream came to him. He saw a moon rise from the chest of the sheikh, and slowly, it drifted into his own. From that moon, a tree began to grow, rising steadily, its roots deep, its branches stretching outward beyond the edge of sight. The tree grew vast and strong, its leaves casting shade over rivers and plains, over mountains and cities, across lands where people of many kinds gathered beneath its shelter. In this vision, Osman saw markets filled with voices, prayers rising in different tongues, caravans crossing bridges beneath the branches. He saw domes and minarets, ships sailing under stars, rulers cloaked not in gold but in responsibility. The tree's presence was gentle, but firm. It brought peace to some, or to others, and it stood, unmoving, through storms and seasons. When Osman awoke, he told Sheikh Bali what he had seen. The sheikh listened in silence, nodding slowly. And then, with words soft and deliberate, he said that what Osman had seen was not just a dream, it was a sign. The tree was empire. The moon was faith. And from Osman's chest would grow a lineage that would reach far across the world, rooted in belief, in patience, and in justice. This moment, quiet and unrecorded by scribes, became the foundation of everything to come. Osman did not shout it from the rooftops. He did not raise a new banner the next morning or demand loyalty from kings. He simply held it, the meaning, the weight, close to his heart. And from that day onward, something in him changed. His steps carried more intention. His gaze held further distances. He began to see his small tribe not as survivors clinging to the edge of empire, but as the seed of something deeper. Something that would grow, if nurtured properly. And just like that tree in the dream, Osman began to build, not hurriedly, not through force alone, but through steadiness. Through trust. Through waiting for the right season. As years passed, the dream was passed along with him. Whispered by warriors before battle. Remembered by poets. Etched softly into scrolls, coins, and memory. And though the world around him was uncertain, though the land itself changed again and again, Osman kept building in the direction of that tree. For he knew, even if no one else did yet, that something vast had been planted within him. And someday, it would rise. In the early days of Osman's leadership, there was no empire. There was no crown or court. There were only edges, edges of territory, of identity, of faith. And it was in these edges that a unique kind of warrior began to rise, the Ghazis. They were not soldiers in the way we think of today. They had no uniforms. No ranks carved in metal. Many owned little more than the swords at their side and the horses they rode. But they carried something heavier than armor, they carried belief. The Ghazis were frontier warriors, drawn by the spirit of defending Islam and expanding its horizon, not always for conquest, but often for protection. They lived with hardship, moved with purpose, and saw their struggle as sacred. Many came from scattered backgrounds. Some were former farmers. Others were men who had lost their homes to Mongol invasions and now wandered west, searching for new beginnings. Some were spiritual men, others simply brave. But what united them was the quiet bond of devotion, to faith, to brotherhood, and to the idea that even in the smallest village, a seed of justice could grow. Osman did not command them through fear. He welcomed them through dignity. He offered land, not riches. Bread, not titles. And in return, the Ghazis offered loyalty that could not be bought. These warriors helped Osman not just by sword, but by spirit. They became the living roots of what would become the Ottoman military tradition, brave, disciplined, but always guided by a sense of something larger than themselves. But Osman knew that warriors alone do not make nations. So he looked also to the villages, the farmers, the shepherds, the blacksmiths and potters. He built alliances not through conquest, but through marriages, friendships, promises kept. He respected local customs, allowed elders to remain in place, offered protection in exchange for partnership. Slowly, the villages began to fold into his orbit. Not through fear, but through trust. Together, the Ghazis and the villagers formed a living tapestry. One group defending, the other sustaining. One riding out against threats, the other planting wheat, mending boots, and raising children in safety. This delicate web of cooperation allowed Osman's small realm to grow with surprising strength. And soon, as word spread of a leader who honored oaths, who fed the poor, who prayed in silence but acted with quiet resolve, more Ghazis came. More villages followed. This was the real foundation of the Ottoman Empire. Not stone walls or golden crowns, but people, ordinary people, bound together not by conquest, but by belief. In Osman. In each other. In something sacred taking root on the edge of a fading world. It was not yet called an empire. But it was alive. Part 2, Crescent over Byzantium, the fall of Constantinople. The world had not yet learned to say his name with awe. Not yet. When Mehmed was just a boy, his name was spoken with worry, with hesitation, even within the walls of his own court. He was not yet the conqueror of Constantinople. Not yet the builder of empires or the dreamer of 2 continents. He was simply Mehmed. Young. Observed. Watched closely. He became sultan at the tender age of 12. A child handed the weight of a state that had grown too large, too complex for still hands. And yet, even at that age, there was something in him that unsettled the old advisors. He did not rage or boast. He studied. He questioned. He read ancient texts and examined old maps as if trying to peer into time itself. While others played games of court and comfort, Mehmed gazed upon Constantinople, that vast, legendary city that split the world in 2, and whispered to himself that it would one day be his. Not for gold, not for glory, but for completion. He believed no ruler was whole until he held that city. It was a wound in the middle of the empire, one that must be healed. But they did not let him keep the crown. Not yet. The viziers grew nervous. Rebellion stirred. And soon, his father Murad was called back from retirement. The boy returned to study, to silence, to watching, not in shame, but in patience. He did not resist. He waited, because Mehmed knew something few others did. He had time. Time to learn languages. Time to understand gunpowder. Time to study ancient sieges, old philosophies, the weaknesses of walls and of men. He studied Greek and Latin, spoke Persian and Arabic, surrounded himself with scholars and engineers and architects, not flatterers. And when his father passed, Mehmed did not celebrate. He simply stepped forward, not as a boy, but as a man forged in waiting. He rode through the capital not with songs and parades, but with a quiet air of certainty, as if something long overdue had simply resumed. His eyes still fixed on that city across the Bosporus. Still split in shadow and memory. Others had tried to take it. But Mehmed would not try. He would succeed. Because this was not conquest to him. It was destiny. A story written long ago. One he had been born to finish. Constantinople, the queen of cities, no longer gleamed the way it once did. Its golden age was long past, and though its walls still stood high and proud, the soul of the city had grown weary. Cracked marble, faded mosaics, empty halls where emperors once walked. The streets echoed less with laughter and more with whispers of what had been. Still holy, still defiant, but tired. Once, it had ruled empires. The crossroads of East and West. A city bathed in the light of 2 worlds. But by the time Mehmed fixed his gaze upon it, it was surrounded, not just by soldiers, but by time itself. The Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city walls and a few villages. Within, life continued, but it was a life haunted by waiting. The emperor, Constantine XI, ruled with dignity but little hope. He knew the world beyond the walls was changing. The Ottomans were no longer a distant threat, they were a rising tide that had reached his doorstep. Supplies were low. Allies, hesitant. Rome had sent promises, but not enough ships. Not enough men. The city prayed, but the prayers felt thinner with each passing night. Outside, Mehmed gathered. Slowly. Intentionally. Not with reckless charge, but with architects of war. Massive cannons, foreign engineers, careful logistics. The siege was not a storm, it was a tide, pulling closer by the hour. And yet, inside those ancient walls, the people clung to memory. To mosaics of saints. To crumbling scriptures. To a hope that had carried them through invasions before. But this time felt different. The enemy did not just want the city, He understood it. Mehmed didn't march against Constantinople with hate. He approached it with reverence, with strategy, with destiny, as if this final confrontation was not a battle, but a chapter long awaited. And so, for weeks, the city stood still, surrounded not only by Ottoman soldiers, but by the weight of history pressing in from all sides. Within, candles flickered. Outside, siege towers creaked. And above, the moon watched, silent and unmoving. The last empire of Rome stood at the edge of breath, waiting for the silence to break. Each morning, the mist would rise from the ground like quiet ghosts, curling around the fields outside Constantinople. But mingled with that mist, there came a sound, not sudden, not sharp, but deep. A low, distant rumble, like the earth was groaning in its sleep. These were the bombards. Ottoman cannons, vast beyond belief. Forged in sweat and flame, dragged by hundreds of oxen across mountains and rivers, they had finally arrived beneath the walls that had withstood every siege for 1,000 years. And now they whispered thunder. Mehmed had spared no expense. The greatest of these cannons, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, stretched over 27 feet in length and could fire stones heavier than a man. It did not roar in anger. It spoke in rhythm, slow, patient, and inevitable. Boom. A pause. Then dust rising from stone. Boom again. And the walls trembled. The defenders had never seen anything like it. They rushed to repair the breaches, stacking sacks, stones, timber. They prayed not just to saints, but to the walls themselves. For these walls were more than defense, they were identity. If they fell, something deeper than stone would break. Inside, the city held its breath. Children flinched. Mothers clutched crosses. The clergy sang softer now, as if trying to steady their own hearts. The sound of cannon fire wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder. That time moves. That even the unbreakable can crack. Mehmed did not press recklessly. He let the cannons speak for him. Day after day. Week after week. A careful patience, as if even he respected the walls he meant to destroy. And the walls, they answered. They stood. They cracked. They held. They bled. Each stone that fell told a story of the city's past. A century chipped away in every blast. The Byzantines, defiant, kept rebuilding. But they were growing tired. The tremors beneath their feet were not just from weapons, they were from history itself, shifting beneath them. One rumble at a time. It came not at midnight, nor at dawn, but in that in-between time, when night begins to loosen and the sky hasn't yet made up its mind. The air was still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath. And then, as if exhaling what had long been held back, the final breach began. It wasn't sudden. Not an explosion. Not a cry. Just a slow cracking. A give in the ancient stone. The walls, once proud, once sure, had grown thin. Tired. Worn from weeks of trembling. And then they opened. Ottoman soldiers poured forward, not in chaos, but in rhythm. Years of planning. Weeks of waiting. Now, steps fell with purpose on broken stone. Mehmed, who had watched the walls like a scholar studying a sacred text, now watched his men pass through them, not as invaders, but as participants in something far older than them all. Inside the city, bells rang, not in celebration, but in warning. In grief. The defenders ran to meet the breach, but they were too few. Too tired. Too mortal. Dust filled the air. Then came the banners, the boots, the blades. Quiet in memory, loud only to those who lived it. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, fought not like a ruler, but like a man with nothing left to lose. Sword in hand, cloak torn, surrounded by the fall of what once was. No one saw exactly how he died. No one needed to. Some say he vanished into the crowd, removing his regalia to die as one of his own people. A quiet end to a long line. Elsewhere, churches were entered, treasures taken, candles extinguished. But even in that, there was no joy. Only the hush of finality. Even the Ottomans, triumphant, knew this was not conquest alone. This was the closing of a chapter written in stone and sweat and centuries. And then, it was done. The gates were open. The city had changed hands. And the world itself shifted, ever so slightly. Mehmed entered not with cheers, but with stillness. He walked through Hagia Sophia, eyes lifted to the domes. A space built to echo glory now echoed only footsteps. He did not destroy it. He preserved it. He converted it, yes, but gently and with awe. Because even he knew, you do not erase the past. You build upon it. The city did not die when it fell. It paused, exhaled, and in that breath, between ruin and renewal, a new identity began to shape itself. They would call it Istanbul now. A name not shouted into the sky, but spoken softly, shaped by the mouths of merchants, soldiers, poets, and wanderers. Mehmed too did not treat the city as a trophy. He treated it as a seed. He ordered the repair of aqueducts, the clearing of rubble, the reopening of markets. He called upon artisans and builders, inviting Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Persians, not just to populate the city, but to compose it, like instruments returning to a forgotten melody. Minarets rose beside broken domes. The call to prayer now drifted where chants once echoed. But the spirit of the city, that strange, sacred pull, remained. Istanbul was not a city erased and rewritten. It was a city reawakened. Its streets remembered every footstep, even as new ones were laid. The Hagia Sophia, once the beating heart of Byzantium, now opened as a mosque. But no mosaics were shattered. No walls were torn. Mehmed stood beneath its dome with reverence, not conquest. He knew, some things are too ancient to conquer. You can only carry them forward. He established endowments, built schools, funded libraries. A city of books and swords. Of silence and whispers. He dreamed not only of territory, but of legacy. Istanbul would not simply be his capital, it would be the spine of an empire that had only just begun to stretch itself across the map. And at night, when the wind quieted and the last lamps dimmed, the city lay beneath a new crescent moon, not the Roman moon of fading light, but the Ottoman crescent of rising dawn. A symbol now etched on banners, coins, and dreams. Istanbul, born from the ashes of Constantinople, was not a victory alone. It was a beginning. The old queen of cities had put on new robes. And beneath them, her heart still beat. In the quiet villages of the Balkans, where church bells rang softly and the seasons moved like prayer, the sound of hooves approaching would cause even the birds to still. Ottoman officials, dressed in layered robes and soft leather boots, had arrived. Not as invaders, this time, but as harvesters. Not of grain, but of boys. This was the devsham, the gathering. A system born not from cruelty, but from strategy. From vision. The empire was expanding fast, and Mehmed's successors understood that to govern such a vast realm, they needed not just warriors, but loyal minds. Minds shaped by the state itself. Untouched by bloodlines, unaffected by tribal loyalties. Pure potential. Christian boys, often between the ages of 8 and 14, were selected from remote provinces. The strongest, the brightest, the most promising. Taken from their families with both sorrow and solemnity. Some wept. Some stood proud. Some simply didn't understand. Their parents often consented in silence, some out of fear, others out of hope. For though their sons were leaving as peasants, many would return as viziers, governors, scholars, or soldiers whose names history would not forget. These boys were converted to Islam. They were given new names, new languages, taught discipline, mathematics, calligraphy, warfare, astronomy, and faith, all within palace schools or military academies. They were no longer children of the hills or valleys. They were now children of the empire. Some would become janissaries, elite soldiers, fiercely loyal, raised to stand like stone in the face of death. Others would climb higher still, becoming architects of state policy, advisors to the Sultan, protectors of law and culture. It was a paradox wrapped in silence. A system born from separation that created the most unified class in the empire. To the outside world, it may seem cruel to take a child from his mother's arms. But within the halls of Topkapi, those children became something else. Something both admired and feared. They carried the empire's dreams in their bodies. And though they came from different soil, they all grew beneath the same sun. So the Ottoman Empire rose not only on conquest, but on cultivation. The devshirme was not just a policy. It was a foundation. The city of Istanbul, reborn from the bones of empires, began to breathe with a rhythm all its own. Its streets hummed with the murmur of merchants, the clatter of carts, the slow steps of scholars wrapped in robes of ink and dust. But beneath this tranquil order, something even more carefully crafted was forming. A force not raised in chaos, but carved in stillness. A force of men who did not come from noble blood, but from something much more rare, discipline without ego. They were called the Janissaries. To speak of the Janissaries is to speak of silence itself. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of control. They were the finest soldiers the world had seen. But they were not born that way. They were shaped by time, by ritual, and by the quiet hands of the state. They came from the devshirme, taken as boys from Christian families in distant villages. But what was once a sorrow became a transformation. Their new home was not just a barracks, but a monastery of sorts. Here, swords were not just weapons. They were lessons. Here, obedience was not demanded. It was learned. And above all, here, identity was erased and rewritten with purpose. They were forbidden from marrying. Forbidden from owning private property. Their loyalty was not to family, or tribe, or past. It was to the Sultan. Only him. Always him. They trained without end. Marching not with fury, but with precision. When they moved as one body. One breath. Their uniforms were simple. White turbans, long robes, and the distinctive bork, a high felt cap that rose like a silent promise above their brow. No golden armor. No banners. Just presence. Quiet, watchful, firm. They carried matchlock muskets, long before Europe embraced gunpowder widely. They learned not only how to shoot, but when not to. They were deployed only at moments of great need. Not like wild dogs thrown into a skirmish, but like a scalpel drawn at just the right time. And when they appeared on the battlefield, a hush would spread. Not among themselves, but among their enemies. Even their songs, their marches, were carefully crafted, rhythmic, deep, drumming like a heartbeat beneath the empire's skin. To hear the Janissaries coming was to feel the weight of inevitability. But their true strength was not only in battle. It was in what they represented. They were the will of the Sultan, embodied. A force that required no crown, no speech. Just command. They were both sword and shield, weapon and wall. And when they stood guard outside the palaces, it was not with arrogance, but with the serenity of a mountain that knows its place in the world. Over time, their numbers grew. Their influence seeped into politics, into courts, into memory. But here, in their rise, in this early, focused moment, they were at their purest. The quiet edge of empire. The disciplined soul of conquest. They did not fight for gold, or glory, or even God. They fought because they were Janissaries. And that, in itself, was enough. The Ottoman Empire did not rise with chaos. It rose with quiet persistence, a steady breath, a long shadow that moved over rivers, valleys, and kingdoms not in haste, but in rhythm. One province at a time. One promise at a time. One inevitable step after another. To the north and west lay the ancient lands of the Balkans, a region not yet fully claimed by any single crown, fractured by dynasties, faiths, and fiefdoms. Serbia, Bulgaria, Wallachia, Bosnia. Mountains and forests where the sun fell through leaves like fragments of stained glass. Here, the Ottomans did not just arrive with swords, they arrived with time. They built bridges where there were none. Roads where there were only tracks. Mosques in towns that had only known silence. And in return, they asked not for worship, but for order. Taxes. Obedience. Quiet. To many local rulers, this was better than the chaos of rival Christian lords. The Ottomans offered structure, and in time, even protection. Some joined willingly. Others were absorbed slowly, their flags fading under the growing crescent. But it was not only the west they turned toward. Beyond Anatolia, the east called too. The vast lands of Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Arab world. To conquer the east was not only a military pursuit, it was a spiritual one. Here lay ancient cities like Baghdad and Damascus. Here, the Ottomans sought not just land, but legitimacy. By the 16th century, they marched deeper, reaching into territories that had once belonged to the Abbasids, the Seljuks, the Timurids. Every step taken eastward brought with it both reverence and rivalry. In the Balkans, the people watched the sky for signs. In Persia, poets wrote of the shifting tide. In the Holy Lands, whispers passed from caravan to caravan. The Turks are coming. But even as the empire grew, it did not unravel. It built as it conquered. A village in Hungary might soon hear the call to prayer echo beside the sound of church bells. A town in Syria might find its old Roman aqueducts repaired by Ottoman hands. The empire did not erase. It absorbed. Through a network of governors, pashas, and tax collectors, the Ottomans maintained a grip not through fire, but through familiarity. A local noble might keep his position, so long as he bowed his head to Istanbul. A merchant could keep his trade routes, if his caravan paid its dues. And so, the empire stretched. From the Danube to the Euphrates. From the snow-dusted hills of Albania to the golden sands of Arabia. It did not shout. It whispered. And its whisper became wind. The empire had grown. Its banners fluttered over cities old and new. Its soldiers marched in perfect rhythm. Its courts echoed with the voice of law. And yet, for all its order, all its might, the Ottoman world was not made of stone. It breathed. And the breath that sustained it came from two lungs, the military and the spiritual. Each inhaling duty, each exhaling purpose. In one hand, the Sultan held a sword. In the other, a prayer bead. The Ottomans were warriors, yes. But they were also deeply, quietly faithful. Their empire was not just a realm of borders, but of belief. This balance began at the very top. The Sultan himself was not only a ruler, he was the Caliph, the shadow of God on earth. To his people, he was not simply king. He was protector of the faith. His rule, though absolute, was guided by something higher, divine law, or Sharia, interpreted through scholars, not generals. And so beneath the roar of cannon and the thrum of cavalry, there was always a quieter rhythm. The hum of a dervish chant, the turning of a Koran's page, the hush of prayer at dusk. In the military camps, even the fearsome Janissaries paused 5 times a day. They knelt where they stood, facing the holy city, their muskets resting gently by their sides. Mosques rose wherever the empire spread, not just as places of worship, but as centers of education, diplomacy, and law. The great Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, built by the architect Sinan, stood not only as a monument to God, but as a mirror of empire, vast, measured, balanced. The ulama, or religious scholars, formed a parallel pillar of power. They did not command armies. They guided souls. And their counsel was sought in matters of war, taxation, marriage, inheritance. The quiet, everyday questions that held the fabric of society together. Even in moments of expansion, the Ottomans framed conquest as a sacred duty. Not of domination, but of stewardship. They called it Gaza, the struggle not just against enemies, but against chaos. Against injustice, against forgetting who one is. And yet, this harmony was fragile. Tensions would arise. Generals who grew too proud. Sultans who leaned more toward opulence than piety. But when the empire was at its strongest, it was because the soldier listened to the scholar, and the scholar walked beside the soldier. One protected the body, the other, the soul. And between them, an empire walked forward, neither too heavy with power, nor too light with faith. When the Ottoman banners were planted in a new city, whether it was a bustling port along the Adriatic, a hill town in the Balkans, or a desert village near Damascus, conquest did not always continue with fire and steel. Often, it settled into something quieter, more enduring. The Ottomans, unlike many empires before them, understood that to hold a place was not only to guard it, but to nurture it. And so they built. Not walls, but mosques. Not fortresses, but bazaars. The Ottoman mosque was more than a place of prayer. It was the gentle heart of a neighborhood, a gathering space, a school, a soup kitchen, a clinic. It anchored the community both spiritually and physically. Walk through any city touched by Ottoman hands, Sarajevo, Skopje, Aleppo, Bursa, and you will find the signature dome rising like a calm breath above the rooftops. Not towering over the people, but nestled among them. Architects like Mimar Sinan, who had once been a soldier, left behind not scars, but silhouettes, curved and balanced, as if drawn by the horizon itself. The mosques he designed were built to echo with softness. Footsteps on stone. Pages turning. Water flowing from fountains in the courtyard. These were places made to calm the soul, even in cities that had once been battlegrounds. And alongside these domes came the market, the bazaar, the caravanserai, the spice roads echo. Here, traders laid out their silks and spices, their rugs and lanterns, their brassware and figures. And in that daily exchange, coins handed across worn wood, greetings offered in dozens of languages, peace found its footing. Markets thrived under Ottoman rule because the empire, for all its might, respected the pulse of trade. It protected the roads, maintained the scales, punished theft harshly, but honored hospitality deeply. A merchant from Venice could sit across from a weaver from Aleppo, sharing coffee beneath a latticed window, while prayer called gently in the background. This harmony, between mosque and market, was not perfect. But it was patient. In cities where flags had changed a dozen times, the Ottomans brought something that lingered, a rhythm of order. A sense of continuity. Peace, not as a moment after war, but as something built, over time, with care. They believed that a mosque could heal where swords had cut. that a well-run market could bring strangers into understanding, that faith and commerce, spirit and survival, could live side by side, like domes beside stalls, prayer beside price. And so, long after the first Ottoman soldiers had moved on, the cities they passed through remained, not just subdued, but alive. Still praying, still trading, still breathing beneath the quiet shape of an empire. Part 4. The Age of Suleiman, Law, Art, and Power. Let us now open the doors to an era where the empire, already vast, found its greatest symmetry, a moment when sword and scripture, marble and ink, justice and beauty, all moved to the rhythm of one man's reign. A man remembered not merely for his conquests, but for the way he made power elegant. Before the world called him the Magnificent, he was simply Suleiman. A prince born into privilege, yes, but also into pressure to lead, to expand, to surpass those who came before. Yet Suleiman carried this burden with a grace that few rulers have ever matched. Not only a warrior or a strategist, though he was both, he was, quietly and profoundly, a poet. He wrote in secret, often under a pen name, crafting verses that spoke of love, loss, longing, and the divine. His words, penned in the early light before court or battle, hinted at the depths within, a ruler whose inner life pulsed just as richly as his outer empire. One of his poems reads, "The people think of wealth and power as the greatest fate. But in this world, a spell of love is the only throne." These were not the lines of a cold conqueror. They belonged to someone who understood that empires are not built only with stone and steel, but with vision and with restraint. Suleiman's reign began like many others, with the call of war. He pushed the empire further into Europe, capturing Belgrade, laying siege to Rhodes, and standing at the gates of Vienna. But unlike others, his victories did not intoxicate him. They sobered him. For every battle, he sought balance. Every campaign was followed by policy. Every act of expansion met with reform. He did not simply rule his people. He shaped how they would be ruled. Under Suleiman, the law was no longer a scattered collection of decrees and customs. He summoned scholars, jurists, and scribes. He organized, refined, codified, giving birth to what would be remembered as the Canon, the secular laws of the state. While Sharia continued to govern religious life, Canon gave structure to the empire's everyday reality: taxation, property rights, trade, criminal justice. It was not law by whim, it was law by architecture. His palace, Topkapi, reflected this same duality. Lavish, yet meditative. Grand halls opened into quiet courtyards. Jewels sparkled, but were worn with solemnity. The walls echoed with diplomacy, not excess. There, Suleiman met with foreign emissaries, debated with advisors, and passed judgment, always with a calm deliberation that earned him not only admiration, but fear. His was the kind of power that didn't shout. It whispered, and everyone listened. But what truly made Suleiman magnificent was what he left behind. He commissioned mosques, like the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, a quiet masterpiece of symmetry and space. He nurtured the arts, calligraphy, tile work, textiles, music. Under his gaze, Ottoman culture blossomed, not just in opulence, but in meaning. His court became a garden where intellect and beauty were not distractions from governance, but companions to it. And through it all, he remained Suleiman, the man who wrote poems when the world wasn't watching. The ruler who walked between war and wisdom. The empire, in his time, did not merely grow. It matured. He led not by loud decree, but by thoughtful design. And in doing so, he left behind not only a powerful state, but a golden silence echoing softly through time. The Ottoman Empire was vast, a web of languages, cultures, religions, and regions. And with such size came complexity. What was fair in Cairo might be seen as injustice in Belgrade. What worked in Anatolia might unravel in Damascus. The empire needed something more than tradition, more than decrees shouted by guards in a market square. It needed a law, quiet, enduring, and just. And so, Suleiman turned inward, toward the scholar's table, where the future of an empire was not forged, but written. Kanun, meaning code or measure, was not meant to replace religious law. The Ottoman world was deeply shaped by Sharia, the sacred law derived from the Quran and Hadith. But Suleiman saw what few had before, that a state cannot survive on divine law alone. There were matters of tax, trade, inheritance, and punishment that required clarity and consistency. And so, he harmonized the two. He brought together the spiritual wisdom of Islam with the practical needs of governance. Sharia would continue to guide the soul and family, the sacred and personal. But Kanun would shape the roads and the courts, the ports and the punishments, the grain markets and land disputes. One did not silence the other. They moved together, like two currents feeding one wide river. Suleiman worked with jurists, not in haste, but over years, refining, revising, listening. His law was not arbitrary. It wasn't a ruler's whim dressed in ceremony. It was codified, written down, made public. It whispered that the Sultan, for all his might, was not above the rules. He was shaped by them too. In the Kanun, punishments were proportional. Property rights were protected. Merchants were regulated not to restrict trade, but to ensure fairness. Farmers knew what tax they owed. Soldiers knew what behavior would dishonor them. Governors knew the limits of their authority. And the people, peasants, poets, pilgrims, knew what to expect. This harmony of law and faith made the Ottoman Empire something rare. It was not only feared by its enemies but trusted by many of its subjects. Christian peasants in the Balkans, Jewish traders in Istanbul, Arab scholars in Jerusalem, they all lived under the same order, the same quiet structure that gave their days a rhythm. And it all began with Suleiman, sitting beneath lamplit halls, listening to arguments, weighing what was just, and signing his name not with pride, but with purpose. His Kanun became a legacy not carved in stone, but living in silence, in how disputes were settled, how roads were kept safe, how justice was understood not as revenge, but as balance. The great Ottoman Sultan was called the lawgiver not because he ruled with cold authority, but because he ruled with care. He listened. He reasoned. He built not only a state, but a code that made that state trustworthy. And so, while his armies expanded the borders, Suleiman expanded something else, belief in fairness. In order. In something greater than the throne. In every great empire, there is an architect whose work does not merely build cities, but defines an age. For the Ottomans, that architect was Sinan, born of humble roots, trained in the art of engineering, and eventually entrusted with shaping the very skyline of Islamic civilization. Sinan was no ordinary builder. He was a poet of stone, a mathematician of light, a man who looked at the empty sky and saw not emptiness, but possibility. And under Suleiman's patronage, he was given both canvas and freedom. Across the empire, Sinan raised more than 300 structures, bridges, aqueducts, schools, tombs, but it is his mosques that breathe with the deepest serenity. Not because they were grand, though they were. Not because they were complex, though they astounded the mind. But because they felt balanced. Perhaps no work better reflects this harmony than the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, his gift to Suleiman, and a quiet crown to the empire's golden age. Built high above the city, where seagulls will over domes and the Bosphorus glimmers far below, the Suleimani does not shout. It sighs. It welcomes. It feels like silence made solid, vast, open, gently echoing. Inside, its central dome floats as if weightless, held aloft by careful proportions and hidden supports. Light filters through stained glass not in piercing beams, but in soft washes. Even the tiles, richly blue and green, carry not noise but reverence. And beneath that dome, thousands could gather, shoulder to shoulder, prayer to prayer, yet still feel that they were alone with the divine. Sinan believed that architecture was not about the materials, but the experience. A good building, he once said, should make a man feel smaller, not lesser, but more aware. More grounded. More humble before the mysteries of the world. His mosques, scattered across Anatolia and the Balkans, became places of both prayer and pause. Their courtyards offered cool shade. Their fountains trickled endlessly, not loud, but always present, like memory. Their minarets rose like reeds in a still pond, slender and sure. And beyond the mosques themselves, Sinan also reimagined urban life. He planned around symmetry. He believed that cities should be lived in, not just passed through. He placed libraries near prayer halls. Hospitals near kitchens. A city, in his mind, was an organism, and architecture was its heartbeat. It is said that even in old age, Sinan climbed scaffolding to inspect stones, to trace lines with tired fingers. He wanted every inch to breathe intention. And when he died, he was buried beside the Suleimani, not inside it, not beneath it, but near enough to still hear the echo of footsteps. A man who shaped the silence of the empire, and left behind monuments that would still hum gently with breath centuries later. Now, as we linger in this part of the story, in these domed sanctuaries and tiled arcades, we begin to feel what Suleiman may have known all along. That true greatness isn't in how high a building rises, but in how quietly it makes the soul feel lifted. Then let us drift now from stone to sea, from domes that reach the sky, to sails that caught the wind. Because while Suleiman's empire was built on land, its reach, its true reach, stretched across the waves. And there, in the churning waters of the Mediterranean, a new kind of power rose quietly beneath a red banner. The sea in the 16th century was not simply a route, it was a theater of power. Trade flowed across it. Spies whispered upon it. Empires fought not only for ports, but for presence, for the shadow they could cast across distant shores. For the Ottomans, their empire needed more than walls and horses. It needed ships. It needed strength where land could not protect. And so came Barbarossa. Born Khair al-Din, but known in Europe by the name whispered with fear and awe, Barbarossa, the Red Beard. He was a sailor of skill, a commander of deep intuition, and eventually, the admiral of the Ottoman fleet. Barbarossa was not just a warrior. He was a tactician of tides. He understood wind, weight, the dance of cannons across decks and the slow patience of blockades. He sailed not in chaos, but in calculation. Under his command, the Ottoman navy turned from scattered coastal ships into a dominant maritime force. He established strongholds across North Africa, reclaimed key Aegean islands, and transformed Algiers into an Ottoman stronghold. But perhaps his greatest triumph was not a conquest, it was a challenge to the greatest naval powers of Europe. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa met a mighty fleet led by the Holy League, a coalition of Christian powers backed by Venice and the papacy. Outnumbered, outgunned, he should have lost. But the sea obeys not numbers, but mastery. Barbarossa used narrow straits and swift turns to divide his enemies. He struck with precision, vanishing before counterfire. And by the end of the day, the Mediterranean belonged not to Europe, but to the Ottoman Crescent. This victory would ripple for decades. For 40 years after Preveza, No European fleet dared challenge Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes shifted. Coastal cities bowed. And the empire's banner flew not only on mosques, but on masts. But perhaps most quietly impressive was what the navy made possible beyond warfare. It carried architects and artists to distant provinces. It ferried scholars and goods, ideas and reforms, from Istanbul to Cairo to Algiers. It made the empire not just an arch of land, but an arc of connection. Barbarossa himself, though fierce in legend, died peacefully in Istanbul. And even in death, he remained close to the sea. His tomb still stands near the Bosphorus, and sailors of the Turkish navy salute him each time they pass, a gesture not of superstition, but of respect. He had commanded the waves, not with tyranny, but with vision. He proved that a sailor's mind could shape empires just as surely as a sultan's sword. And so, as we leave the sea behind and step once more onto the shore, we carry the echo of waves. Not wild, but rhythmic, steady, like the heart of an empire that understood. To rule the world, you must listen to the currents. Let us now step gently away from the clang of steel and the roar of cannons, and enter a quieter space, not just in sound, but in spirit. Because what lies ahead is not a story of conquest, but of containment, of how a vast empire, once expanding in every direction, learned instead to hold, to govern, and to breathe. As Suleiman aged, the empire around him matured. No longer frantic to conquer, it became deliberate in its rhythm, like a seasoned tree, no longer reaching wildly for the sun, but thickening its roots. This was no longer an empire of constant expansion. It had become, in its own quiet way, a world within a world. And at its center sat the Sultan. Suleiman, once the thunder of battlefields, now ruled from stillness. His was a reign of ink as much as iron. Of patience. Of poetry. His court no longer echoed with the clash of new campaigns, but with the calm labor of order. Laws were revised, not redrawn. Governors were appointed not for loyalty alone, but for balance. Roads were repaired. Coins were reminted. Markets were watched not for rebellion, but for fairness. The Ottoman world became a web, vast and deliberate, from the spice-rich ports of Yemen to the snow-capped mountains of the Balkans, all held together not just by force, but by trust in the crown. And that trust rested on Suleiman's stillness. Not the stillness of indecision, but the kind that comes with knowing that movement is no longer always necessary. That a whisper can do what a war once did. He would often walk the palace gardens in silence, accompanied only by a single page or advisor. There, among fountains and cypress trees, he would read, write verse, or simply listen, to the rustling of leaves, to the murmurs of petitions brought before him, to the empire breathing beneath his rule. Even as Europe tensed with religious wars, as kings clashed and cities burned, the Ottoman lands, though never perfect, stood as a kind of calm continent, where mosques were cleaned before dawn, where judges ruled with consistency, and where, for a time, life unfolded in measured dignity. And while peace is often less dramatic than war, it is heavier. It takes more strength to hold a vast realm in balance than to charge another city. Suleiman held that balance not with fire, but with stillness. And the world noticed. Ambassadors from France, Venice, even Persia and India came to his court not just with gifts, but with questions. How does one govern so many peoples, so many faiths, and keep them from turning on one another? The answer was simple, yet subtle, a careful mixture of firm law and flexible mercy. A belief that difference need not mean disorder. And an understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a ruler can do is wait. And so, as the world outside trembled with the rise of new powers and the fall of old ones, the Ottoman Empire, in these golden twilight years of Suleiman, found a rare thing in history: stillness without stagnation, power without panic, and peace, not from exhaustion, but from wisdom. We now stand at the edge of this golden hour, just before the light begins to change. For what follows will be quieter, yet more fragile. Then let us now pass through the great imperial gates, beyond the outer courts and marble fountains, into a place few have truly known. A world wrapped in silence, luxury, duty, and invisible power. Part 5. Life inside the harem and the palace. At first glance, it was merely a palace. But to those who lived and served within its gilded walls, Topkapi was far more. It was a kingdom nestled within an empire. A quiet, beating heart surrounded by rose gardens and blue tiles, where whispers moved history more than swords. Perched above the Bosphorus, the palace watched the waters endlessly, its domes glinting in the morning sun. But behind its gates, life unfolded in strict layers, like a series of veils. Each courtyard, each corridor, each doorway led deeper into a world where rank was sacred and privacy was law. There was the imperial council chamber, where viziers debated the fate of distant provinces. There was the library of Ahmed III, where knowledge slept inside leather-bound manuscripts. There were kitchens the size of fortresses, where chefs prepared feasts not just for sultans, but for thousands of staff, from scribes to bodyguards, gardeners to tutors. Yet the most mysterious space of all lay nestled in the innermost sanctum, the harem. Contrary to popular myth, the harem was not a place of idleness or desire. It was a center of education, strategy, and quiet ambition. It was where future wives of sultans, concubines, and the sultan's own mother, the Valide Sultan, lived in a world of unseen power. The harem was governed by hierarchy and training. Young girls, often brought from across the empire, were taught music, language, calligraphy, and the fine rituals of court etiquette. Some remained servants. Others rose to become favorites, or mothers of princes. And at the center of it all was the Valide Sultan, one of the most powerful women in the empire. She could influence court appointments, negotiate with foreign envoys, and even shape succession. This realm of silk and stone was guarded, not just by doors, but by silence. Only the eunuchs of the Black Guard, fiercely loyal and highly trusted, moved between the Sultan's quarters and the harem itself. Even the Grand Vizier could not enter without permission. Yet for all its seclusion, life inside Topkapi was never truly still. Children's laughter echoed softly in private gardens. Lessons in philosophy unfolded under lantern light. Poets composed verses that would never leave the walls. And the Sultan himself might wander at twilight, moving from prayer to poetry to the warm stillness of the harem's tiled halls. It was not merely a palace. It was a mind, the empire thinking, resting, preparing. It was a mirror, reflecting the vastness of Ottoman rule in miniature form. And just as the empire stretched across continents, so too did this place hold within it every emotion. Devotion, fear, ambition, tenderness, and power. Each cloaked in silence, each hidden behind a curtain or carved screen. So now, we leave the palace not with noise, but with reverence. For here, in this quiet maze of domes and shadows, the Ottoman world dreamed, planned, and remembered what it meant to endure. Let us linger a little longer in the hush of silk-draped corridors. For beyond the gossip of foreign envoys and the myths whispered by distant travelers, the harem was not a place of scandal, but of strategy. Not a hidden indulgence, but a hidden court. To understand the harem is to let go of fantasy and lean into the truth of quiet power. Behind its ornate gates lay not just beauty, but influence. Not just women, but women who watched, learned, and shaped history. Softly, but unmistakably. Here, In the innermost section of Topkapi Palace, hundreds of women lived, studied, and grew. From distant corners of the empire, they arrived as young girls: Circassian, Georgian, Albanian, Armenian, Balkan, Arab. Each one a thread woven into the careful embroidery of court life. They were not idle. From the day they entered, their world became one of discipline and training. Language, literature, recitation of holy texts, music, dance, embroidery, diplomacy. Every gesture mattered. Every silence had a meaning. To rise within the harem was not a matter of beauty, it was a matter of presence. At the heart of this veiled society stood the Valide Sultan. The Sultan's mother, often the most powerful woman in the empire. She advised the Sultan, made or broke court alliances, managed the affairs of the harem, and even influenced imperial appointments. She was revered, obeyed, and feared, not because she ruled loudly, but because she understood the palace better than anyone else. Within the harem, rivalries brewed in whispers. Alliances were formed with glances. Future sultans were cradled, educated, and shaped here. Not in military camps, but in warm chambers surrounded by lullabies and caution. Some concubines rose to unimaginable power, becoming wives, mothers of sultans, and political actors in their own right. Women like Harem Sultan, who wrote letters to kings and negotiated with viziers, changed the course of Ottoman politics without ever stepping beyond the garden walls. And yet, they were watched, protected and imprisoned at once. For every powerful figure, there were dozens who faded into silence. Their names lost, their ambitions never spoken aloud. Still, the harem persisted, not as a place of scandal, but as a school of endurance, a theater of soft politics, a sanctuary where love, faith, manipulation, and motherhood collided in unseen ways. To those outside, the harem remained a mystery. To those inside, it was everything. A life behind latticework windows. A universe where the most important moves were made not with armies, but with quiet decisions passed through corridors. And so, as the world beyond spun with swords and treaties, the empire's most subtle battles were fought with soft voices, firm wills, and unspeakable patience. Shall we step forward now, past the marble walls and perfumed veils, into a more public world once more, where sultans changed, tensions grew, and the future of the Ottoman Empire would begin to shift beneath the weight of time? Let us pause, and center our gaze not on the Sultan, nor the soldiers who carried his banner, but on the quiet force who often shaped him before he ever sat the throne. The one whose influence ran deeper than titles, sharper than politics. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and often, the true power behind the empire's pulse. She did not ride at the front of armies. She held no sword, signed no decrees. But her presence was felt in every decision, every whisper, every turn of fate within the palace walls. The Valide Sultan was not simply the mother of the Sultan. She was the guardian of the dynasty's blood, the steward of legacy, and the soul of the imperial harem. To understand her role, we must begin long before she earned the title. Many Valide sultans began life as foreign-born concubines. Taken in youth, educated within the harem, elevated by wisdom and favor, and eventually chosen by the sultan to bear his heirs. But motherhood in the palace was never just maternal. It was political. Once her son ascended the throne, the Valide sultan rose with him, granted not only honor, but space, staff, wealth, and most of all, voice. She was the only woman permitted to appear in official council meetings, often from behind a delicate screen. Her apartments were expansive, richly adorned, and bustling with messengers, envoys, and servants. For she was not just a figure of domestic affection, but a strategist, a negotiator, a shadow diplomat. She could make or unmake viziers. She could broker peace between rival factions within the palace. She advised the Sultan in matters of governance, religion, and family. And often, when he was young or inexperienced, she shaped the very way he ruled. Yet her power did not stem from loudness. It came from stillness, from watching and remembering, from surviving long enough to understand the palace better than anyone else. She was the center of a quiet storm, a figure both respected and feared, a matriarch who carried the empire in the folds of her robes. Some Valide sultans, like Kozum and Turhan, wielded power so effectively that they acted as regents, ruling in their sons' names when the empire's future hung in fragile balance. Still, they walked a dangerous line. For every Valide who rose to prominence, another fell victim to court intrigue, jealousy, or shifts in power. But while the names may fade, the role endured. And its echo can be heard in every corner of Ottoman governance. A quiet wisdom that reminded the court that the strength of the empire was not always forged on the battlefield, but often nurtured in the hush of a mother's quarters. So let us leave her now, not as a background figure, but as a central presence in the rhythm of the Ottoman story. She was not just a mother to a sultan. She was mother to the very idea of empire. And in her footsteps, the next chapters unfold, with both the grandeur and the fragility that would come to define the later Ottoman age. Within the palace, power was never one voice. It was a murmur, layered and elusive, passed between veils, eyes, and silences. The eunuchs were its gatekeepers. Castrated as boys, often taken from lands far from the imperial core, they were reshaped entirely to serve the empire. Neither soldier nor servant in the traditional sense. They stood at the crossroads between the male and female worlds of court life. And they held the keys to both. There were two distinct classes. The black eunuchs, who served the harem, and the white eunuchs, who often guarded the sultan and served in administrative roles. Of them, the chief black eunuch rose to immense prominence, often more powerful than most viziers. For he controlled access to the sultan's mother, his children, and his most private thoughts. But their power did not lie in loud command. It lay in presence, in knowing who whispered what, who visited whom, who plotted softly in candlelight. They were the listeners, the watchers. They understood the delicate machinery of emotion and ambition. Alongside them moved the concubines, not simply companions, but women selected for their intelligence, adaptability, and grace. Their lives were a long preparation. To serve, to observe, and in rare cases, to rise. Some bore children. A few became favorites. Even fewer became consorts or mothers to future sultans. And once a concubine became a mother, her world shifted. She now had a stake in the lineage, a claim to legacy. And with it, an unspoken influence that could ripple outward through alliances, favors, and silences. She was taught to remain quiet when needed, and to speak only when it mattered most. Her power did not come from confrontation, but from careful orchestration, planting ideas where they could grow in someone else's voice. Together, the eunuchs and the concubines formed a vast, living web of influence, linking the personal to the political, the private to the public. They orchestrated marriages. They tempered rivalries. They passed messages between chambers that decided the fate of provinces. It was influence without announcement, power without crown. Yet no sultan ruled without them. And so, when we speak of Ottoman might, of armies, of laws, of architecture that touched the sky, we must also speak of this quieter empire within the empire. For while soldiers won land, it was the palace's unseen minds and hearts who kept it from falling apart. As we draw the veil on this chamber, let us remember, history is not always made in battle. Sometimes, it is composed slowly, in steps so soft they leave no footprint, yet still carry the weight of an empire. The Ottoman Empire, once a rising star among fractured kingdoms, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe's greatest powers, not as a guest, but as a rival. The dream of expansion pressed westward, reaching for cities wrapped in legend and lined with stone. And at that frontier between two worlds stood a city known to all, feared by many, and desired by empires. Vienna. Part 6. Between Europe and the East, the Border Wars. The year was 1529. Suleiman the Magnificent, already the master of vast lands, sought to press the Ottoman Crescent deeper into Europe. It was not merely a campaign for territory, but a declaration that the Ottomans were no longer a frontier power, but an empire meant to shape the destiny of continents. The road to Vienna was long and heavy with the weight of ambition. Tens of thousands marched under Suleiman's banner, soldiers, engineers, cannons pulled by oxen, and scribes ready to record history in ink and blood. Behind them, a trail of preparation, bridges built, rivers crossed, towns subdued. Before them, a city that had resisted empires before, and now braced for one more storm. The siege began in September. Cold winds swept across the Danube. Rains turned the ground to thick, unyielding mud. Ottoman cannons, massive, thunderous, were dragged into position, aimed at Vienna's walls with mechanical resolve. But nature, as ever, was an empire of its own. The rains worsened. The cannons sank. Food supplies dwindled, slowed by flooded roads and hostile countryside. The Austrians, though vastly outnumbered, held their ground with grim resolve. And the city's ancient walls whispered memories of other failed invasions. Inside the Ottoman camps, weariness spread like frost. Fires were hard to keep alight. Tents soaked through. The promise of a swift victory grew distant. And in its place came coughing, frost-bitten fingers, and questions never spoken aloud. After just over 2 weeks, the siege was lifted. Not in fiery defeat, but in quiet, resigned retreat. It was not that the Ottomans had grown weak. It was that the weather had grown stronger. Suleiman withdrew not in shame, but in recognition that even the mightiest empires must sometimes bow to forces beyond sword and strategy. Yet Vienna would remain, in Ottoman memory and ambition, a door left half open. And the road to Europe, while frostbitten for now, would not be forgotten. As we move forward, the air remains tense. The borderlands uncertain. The Ottomans, though undefeated in spirit, now stood on a fault line, between East and West, faith and fear, ambition and the natural limits of empire. Then, as the Ottoman gaze turned from the mist-covered hills of Europe, it settled once more on the East, where borders were not lines on parchment, but landscapes soaked in history, faith, and rivalry. There, beyond the mountains and deserts, stood a power not unlike their own, fierce, devout, and determined to shape the world in its own image. The Safavid Empire. This was not a struggle born merely of land. It was older than that, deeper. A quiet tension that pulsed beneath politics. The Ottomans followed the sunny path, while the Safavids, ruling over Persia, held fiercely to Shia Islam. And that difference, subtle to some, was enough to turn brothers into adversaries. Along the eastern frontier, where Anatolia blurred into the Zagros Mountains, skirmishes flared like embers in dry grass. Border villages burned. Alliances shifted with the seasons. And in cities like Tabriz or Baghdad, the flags would rise and fall with the wind of war. But this was no simple conflict of swords and walls. It was a rivalry that shaped identity. Each empire defined itself partly in opposition to the other. Faith as banner, culture as armor, memory as map. And amid it all were the people. Traders, farmers, poets, whose lives swayed back and forth as borders moved like tides. To them, The fight was not about doctrine or power. It was about surviving 1 year to the next under rulers who spoke the same language, but worshipped differently. The wars came in waves, sometimes frozen for decades, then sparked again by a single insult or a breach in diplomacy. Sultans and shahs wrote letters not just with ink, but with the echoes of ancient grievances. And still, through all this tension, caravans moved quietly along ancient paths. Paths lined not with soldiers, but with silk and spice. For even empires at odds understood that the world's breath flowed along trade routes. To shut them down was to hold one's own throat. From the Chinese borderlands to the heart of Constantinople, the roads wound like veins, carrying silk that shimmered like water, paper from distant presses, and dyes so vibrant they seemed otherworldly. But these roads carried more than goods. They bore ideas, stories, shadows. A scroll written in Persia might find its way into a Turkish scholar's hands. A merchant from India might tell tales in a Syrian coffee house. And beneath every trade agreement was a quiet exchange of culture, music, food, language, even dreams. Yet with wealth came danger. Bandits, warlords, and petty toll collectors all laid claim to these arteries of empire. To travel them was to walk a path between opportunity and oblivion. Still, they endured. Because trade was not just profit. It was connection. It was the empire's whisper, reaching out across deserts and seas, saying, "We are here. We exist. We remember." As the sun sets on this part of our story, we find the Ottoman world both expanding and being tested. By distant rivals, by winter's breath, and by the quiet power of silk, slipping between borders no sword could fully control. In the long corridors of Ottoman palaces, where polished tiles reflected candlelight and the scent of old ink lingered in the air, the empire learned that not all wars were fought with swords. Some battles unfolded in whispers, in parchments, in the precise signatures of sultans and shahs. The treaties made between the Ottomans and their rivals, particularly the Safavid Persians, were not simply documents. They were temporary stillnesses carved into centuries of tension. The Treaty of Amasia in 1555 was a quiet moment in a loud century. It acknowledged that there were lines too costly to redraw through blood, and for the first time, it gave shape to peace between two empires that had pulled at each other like opposing winds. But even as envoys bowed and seals were pressed into wax, the ink of the treaty did not dry in the hearts of rulers. Beneath its promises, ambition still stirred. Decades passed, and the paper faded, but the rivalry did not. In 1639, the Treaty of Zuhab again traced borders over rivers and hills, trying once more to define what pride and faith so often defied. Yet treaties in this world were like stones on a riverbank, worn not by time alone, but by the current of human desire. They were made, broken, and made again, as though the empires needed to remember the shape of peace before losing it once more. Each agreement reflected more than diplomacy. It revealed the Ottomans' evolving place in the world, not just as warriors or rulers, but as stewards of order in an age of uncertainty. There were few places on earth where cultures collided so completely and yet continued to breathe side by side. The Ottoman Empire stood not only between Europe and Asia, but between histories, ideologies, and languages. It was a land where call to prayer rose beside the sound of church bells, where Persian poets shared space with Latin philosophers, and where caravans from China crossed paths with ships from Venice. This position, both geographical and spiritual, made the Ottomans more than an empire. They became a bridge. And bridges are not passive. They bear the weight of whatever tries to cross. To the west, Christian kingdoms regarded the Ottomans with suspicion, and sometimes fear, seeing in them both the echo of Rome and the threat of something unfamiliar. To the east, The Persian Safavids mirrored those suspicions in reverse, wary of Ottoman Sunni orthodoxy and political strength. Between these powers, the empire walked a tightrope, managing trade, faith, and conflict with a quiet vigilance that rarely made it into the stories of conquest, but shaped just as much of the world. In its cities, this balance could be seen in the markets, where silks from Samarkand were weighed beside Venetian glass. In its courts, foreign ambassadors from all corners of the known world stood in long, tiled halls, hoping to be heard by a power that spoke many tongues but committed to none fully. This was not neutrality, it was endurance. A deliberate weaving of identities into a singular strength. The Ottomans did not just survive at the crossroads. They thrived by understanding both sides. And in doing so, they became something altogether unique, an empire whose soul was forged not in isolation, but in constant conversation with the world around it. Part 7. The Long Decline, From Glory to Fragility. In the earliest days, the Janissaries had been the pride of the empire, chosen young, molded by devotion, and bound not by wealth but by duty. They were meant to be incorruptible. But centuries pass like waves over stone, and even the strongest institutions begin to wear. What began as a disciplined brotherhood slowly turned into something else. Their loyalty, once unquestioned, grew tangled with politics and privilege. No longer taken from Christian villages and raised in strict military isolation, the Janissaries began to inherit their roles by birth. Sons of Janissaries became Janissaries themselves. The soldier's path, once marked by honor and sacrifice, became a means of social protection, a job to be preserved rather than a duty to be fulfilled. And so, the barracks that once echoed with training and prayer began to swell instead with murmurs of unrest, with demands, and with resistance to reform. They had become powerful, too powerful to be disciplined, yet no longer strong enough to carry the empire's weight. As the empire turned inward, the battles that once shaped its destiny were replaced by whispers within the palace walls. The vast frontier, once teeming with the energy of conquest and ambition, faded behind velvet curtains and mosaic-tiled chambers. In the place of Ghazi warriors came scribes, eunuchs, and advisors, not without merit, but disconnected from the dust and blood that had built the empire. Inside Topkapi, decisions were no longer made on horseback or at the edge of maps, but in quiet courtyards and shadowed halls. Sultans began to rely more heavily on viziers, on mothers, on astrologers and favorites. Power shifted not with declarations but with subtle glances, exchanged letters, and whispered alliances. The empire did not collapse in fire, but in comfort, smothered by the weight of its own opulence. And though the heart still beat, it no longer raced. Far from the palace, the world itself was changing. Silver from the New World poured into Europe, and with it came inflation, disruption, and a shift in global power. The Ottomans, once at the center of East-West commerce, found their trade routes circumvented by sea. Merchant ships now hugged the coasts of Africa, sailed to India and beyond, bypassing the once bustling caravanserais of Anatolia and the Levant. The empire's economy, built upon land and long roads, began to creak beneath the weight of new markets it could not reach and old taxes it could not collect. Guilds suffered. Coinage lost value. Provincial governors grew distant and defiant, collecting more than they delivered, building local power at the expense of the center. And all the while, the people endured, bakers, weavers, teachers, watching their coin buy less, their fields yield more but earn little. The grandeur of empire no longer fed the many. It merely gilded the few. There was a time when the Sultan rode with his men, when his voice commanded legions and his presence rallied cities. But as the centuries wore on, the figure of the Sultan grew more symbolic, a shadow behind lattice screens. Many no longer led campaigns. Some rarely left the palace at all. Raised in isolation, surrounded by luxury and suspicion, young sultans inherited not just thrones but distance, from their people, from their provinces, and often from their own power. They became watchers. Quiet, careful, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, but always removed. Their world was gardens and tutors, traditions and protocol. The realities of war, of famine, of governance, came to them through filtered reports and intermediaries. And while some still tried to rule with wisdom, the chain between vision and action had grown long and fragile. Even in its decline, the Ottoman Empire remained vast, its borders stretched wide, its cities still grand, its armies still feared in many quarters. But beneath the size, something essential had slowed. The rhythm of the state, once vibrant and adaptive, had become hesitant. Reforms were proposed, then buried. Ideas were born, then smothered by fear of change. It did not fall because it was weak. It faltered because it no longer remembered how to move swiftly. And so it drifted, not with violence, but with weariness. Not with rebellion, but with resignation. It remained for now, a fading shadow cast by a once dazzling light, its people still proud, its institutions still functioning, but the soul of empire had grown quieter. Part 8: Reform, Rebellion, and the Tanzimat Era. As the empire drifted into the 19th century, a quiet urgency settled across its aging halls. The world beyond had changed. Industrial revolutions stirred in Europe. Science advanced. Nations reorganized themselves with railways and rights. And so within the Ottoman heartland, a question rose: could an empire rooted in centuries of tradition bend gently toward modernity, without breaking? The Tanzimat reforms began not with fanfare but with gentle pens and thoughtful minds. Scholars, ministers, and visionaries within the empire turned their eyes to education. New schools opened, no longer limited to religious instruction alone. Mathematics, geography, modern languages, once seen as foreign, were now taught beside scripture. Laws were redrawn to echo reason as much as religion. Civil codes emerged that reached toward equality, trying to protect life, property, and dignity regardless of belief. And yet, these changes were layered delicately atop centuries of custom. The call to prayer still echoed through the alleys. The scribe still bowed over his ink and parchment. But somewhere, in quiet classrooms and smoky ministries, a new kind of Ottoman was being shaped, one that belonged to both the past and something uncertain ahead. The changes were not only in thought but in thread. Across garrisons and government halls, robes began to disappear. In their place, stiff collars, brass buttons, and tailored coats arrived, imported ideas stitched into fabric. The fez replaced the turban, symbolizing reform while nodding still to tradition. But change, especially visible change, is never easy. For every young officer proudly adjusting his new sash, there was an old scholar quietly mourning the loss of what had once been sacred dress. The empire began to look different, walk differently, speak differently. Western customs crept in music, in art, in coffeehouse discussions. There was discomfort, yes, but also a quiet hope. A hope that by borrowing from others, the Ottomans could reclaim their strength. That these new clothes might clothe a future that still carried an Ottoman heart. Among the reformers, a group of spirited minds began to rise, the young Ottomans. They were poets and thinkers, idealists and critics, deeply loyal to the empire but painfully aware of its wounds. They believed in progress not for its own sake, but for the survival of what they loved. They wrote in papers. They gathered in secret. They imagined an empire governed not only by decree but by voice, the voice of its people. A constitution. A parliament. A government of law, not just lineage. Their dreams found brief light in 1876, when Sultan Abdulhamid II approved a constitution and opened a parliament. But fear soon returned. The old guards, wary of chaos, whispered against change. And before long, the constitution was suspended. The parliament dissolved. Still, the echo remained, a whispered promise that empire could coexist with freedom, that faith and reason might yet walk together. Signal breaking seems. But not all change came from within. In the empire's outer provinces, especially the Balkans, centuries of tension ripened into rebellion. Christian populations, long taxed and sometimes mistreated, looked to their own history, their own heroes, and began to rise. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, voices that once bowed to Istanbul now cried for independence. The rebellions were brutal. Entire villages burned. Armies marched and countermarched. And though the Ottomans still held much power, the cracks had widened. Russia, ever watchful, stepped in under the banner of protection. The European powers followed, not always out of sympathy, but out of strategy. What had once been the proud edge of Ottoman territory had now become its unraveling hem, fraying under fire, slipping through weary fingers. Through it all, the empire stood at a crossroads. Not yet fallen, not yet transformed. A place where calligraphy met printing press, where coffee houses echoed with both Quranic verses and political debates. A place where the imam and the professor, the soldier and the poet, shared space but not always agreement. There was no violent revolution here, not yet. Only a quiet struggle. A daily negotiation between memory and necessity, between honor and hope. Every reform was a question. Every rebellion, a warning. The empire wanted to endure. But it did not yet know how. And so it swayed gently, pulled by loyalty to its glorious past and the uncertain promise of a changing world. Part 9. The Final Years, War, Loss, and the Empire's End. As the 20th century began, the Ottoman Empire was already a shadow of its once vast self. But the most painful blows were yet to come. In the lands of the Balkans, where Ottoman banners had flown for centuries, rebellion turned to war. One by one, former provinces rose. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro. They joined forces, no longer scattered voices but a storm. The Balkan Wars, brief but brutal, came with ferocity. Ottoman garrisons fell. Ancient mosques burned. Villages that once sang the call to prayer now rang church bells in defiance. It wasn't just territory that was lost, it was history, identity, legacy. Lands that had been Ottoman for hundreds of years slipped away in months. The heart of the empire ached, and with each retreat, the dream of unity grew fainter. What remained was Anatolia, tired, proud, and increasingly alone. The Great War began not in the Ottoman heartland, but in the fields of Europe. Still, its fire spread quickly. The empire, seeking to reclaim strength, chose alliance over neutrality. It joined with Germany and Austria-Hungary, a decision made in secret and sealed with hope and desperation. But the war was not kind. Battles raged in every direction, in the snow-laced mountains of eastern Anatolia, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, along the shimmering shores of Gallipoli. The Ottomans fought bravely, with soldiers who bled for a cause even they didn't always understand. At Gallipoli, they stunned the world by holding off a mighty invasion. But elsewhere, they faltered. The empire's allies weakened. Supplies ran thin. The people starved. And as the world moved on, the Ottomans were left worn, isolated, and burdened with consequences far heavier than they imagined. Within this storm of war, something darker unfolded. Amidst fear, paranoia, and nationalism, the Armenian population, long a part of the Ottoman fabric, was accused of siding with the enemy. What followed was not a battle, but a tragedy. Deportations began. Long columns of families marched into the desert. Many never returned. Others perished in silence. What began as removal turned into extermination. Scholars would later call it genocide. Survivors would whisper its name through tears. And yet, for many within the empire, it was something not spoken aloud, a wound buried beneath the dust of war and denial. Even now, it is a chapter heavy with grief, one that dims the legacy of an empire once known for coexistence, now remembered in part for silence and sorrow. In the golden sands of Arabia, another storm stirred. For centuries, the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire had followed the Sultan Caliph, respecting his spiritual title, even as distance kept them apart. But during the war, that loyalty was tested. British promises whispered through the desert winds, promises of independence, of sovereignty, of a new Arab world free from Ottoman rule. Sharif Hussein of Mecca answered that call. With his sons and tribal allies, he led a revolt that echoed from the Red Sea to Damascus. The Arab revolt was swift and symbolic. Ottoman trains were ambushed. Forts fell. And Lawrence of Arabia, a British officer among Bedouins, became a symbol of betrayal and alliance. The dream of a united Islamic empire fractured into dreams of nation-states. The Ottoman hold on the Arab world dissolved not in thunder, but in shifting sands, dreams carried away by wind and war. In 1918, the war was over. But for the Ottomans, there was no peace in victory, only surrender. Allied forces occupied Istanbul. The once great capital, proud and adorned, was humbled beneath foreign flags. The Sultan remained, cloaked in ceremony but stripped of power. Revolt stirred in Anatolia. A new leader emerged, Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk, who spoke not of empire, but of republic. The Sultanate, ancient and weary, was abolished in 1922. The Caliphate followed 2 years later. And so, the Ottoman Empire, once feared, once admired, once vast beyond imagination, came to a quiet end. Not with a final battle, not with a glorious fall, but with tired eyes turning toward something new. Its stories now rest in stone, in minarets, in forgotten diaries, and in the whispers of bedtime historians. Part 10, Legacy and Echoes, the Ottoman Shadow in the Modern World. Even when empires fall, they do not vanish. Their banners may be lowered. Their sultans may sleep. But their breath remains, soft as the dust that settles on an empty throne, gentle as the breeze through ancient stone. And so it is with the Ottomans. This was no ordinary dominion. For over 6 centuries, they did not simply conquer, they governed, they shaped, they listened, and they endured. From the green hills of the Balkans to the golden deserts of Arabia, from the narrow alleys of Jerusalem to the marble courts of Edirne, the Ottoman pulse ran steady. And even now, that quiet rhythm can still be heard, not with the ears, but with the soul. In Istanbul, where continents lean into one another like old lovers, the Ottoman imprint remains. You can feel it beneath your feet as you walk through the courtyards of mosques older than memory. You can hear it in the rustling of prayer beads, in the smell of simmering lamb and cardamom, in the soft syllables of Turkish that carry Persian and Arabic notes like echoes down a long hallway. The call to prayer still curls through the air, as it did when janissaries marched and poets whispered to the moon. It is a city that remembers, not always proudly, not always easily, but earnestly. And far beyond Turkey's borders, the empire's shadow falls gently, often unnoticed. In the customs of Balkan villages. In the spices of North African kitchens. In legal codes, musical scales, embroidery patterns, lullabies sung to children. The Ottomans, vast, layered, contradictory, never truly left. They reside in these fragments. Not as rulers, but as memories. The idea of the empire, of unity within diversity, of law braided with faith, of rulers who were warriors but also patrons of gardens, libraries, and dreams, still haunts the modern world. It lingers in every capital where power is asked to balance with beauty, where might stands beside mercy, where order tries to find its soul. But the past is not a quiet guest. Some of its echoes soothe, and some wound. The final years of the Ottoman world were not graceful. They were filled with turbulence, silence broken by gunfire and grief. Borders were drawn with trembling hands. Loyalties were tested. Identities were scattered. For Armenians, for Kurds, for Arabs, for Turks themselves, what remained was not only legacy, but trauma. Reverence, yes, but also reckoning. And in modern Turkey, forged from the molten remains of empire, this tension remains alive. The past is honored, questioned, debated, as it must be. How does one inherit a crown made of both glory and guilt? How does a republic carry the weight of a vanished dynasty? Perhaps there are no perfect answers, only the quiet work of remembering with care. For the historian, the Ottoman Empire is not just a tale of battles and rulers. It is a meditation, a mirror, a lesson in what empires do and what they leave behind. In rise and ruin, in splendor and sorrow, in the fragile, flickering lives of those who lived under its wings. So now, after this long and hushed journey, let us rest a moment. Let us close our eyes, not in judgment, not in mourning, but in quiet gratitude. Let us remember Osman, the dreaming boy beneath a tree, whose name would outlive centuries. Let us remember the scholar who inked law into parchment by candlelight. The janissary who whispered a prayer before marching toward a distant battlefield. The poet sultan who ruled with a sword in one hand and verses in the other. The concubine who shaped nations from behind a curtain of silence. The merchant who crossed mountains with silk, figs, and stories. The calligrapher, the architect, the cook, the child, the forgotten. Let us remember that history is not a straight line, but a circle. It does not end. It sleeps. It waits for voices soft enough to hear its breathing. And it welcomes those who walk its path not to dominate, but to understand. So if you've made it here, to the edge of empire's memory, I thank you, deeply, for walking slowly, for listening with your heart. If this tale moved you, even just a little, consider leaving behind a trace. A like, a comment, or simply your quiet return another night. Until then, sleep gently, and may the echoes of old empires watch over your dreams.